So here we are at Retromobile on the Citroën stand. There are a number of production Citroën models here, but we're actually in a very special row of one-off prototypes that haven't really been seen in public for many years, including this one-off GS Camargue prototype designed and built by Bertone in 1972 and shown at that year's Geneva Salon, and actually styled by Gandini, the guy responsible for many great Bertone cars, the Lancia Stratos, the Lamborghini Countach, and as I say, this very, very special Citroën GS, which really started a good and very fruitful long-term relationship between Citroën and Bertone. As a big Citroën fan myself, this is a car I've seen for many years in books and magazines, never actually seen in the flesh. So for me, this is a very exciting moment to be stood here next to this totally unique one-off car. And you can definitely see both Citroën design elements here that Gandini was keen to incorporate and respect in his styling, but also a typical Bertone design. So a lot of the car really reflects the Lancia Stratos, the famous rally car, with this almost sort of crash helmet shaped windscreen that wraps around to the sides here. And it's not quite as extreme, not quite as dramatic and aerodynamic as the Lancia Stratos, but there's definitely common threads there, common elements. And with the car, just looking inside now, so it has a fantastic, very 70s, some tweedy Draylon interior that looks like something from an Indian takeaway of the period. And the dash, lots of space for the passenger, slightly less so for the driver, but the driver has the classic Citroën single-spoke steering wheel. That steering wheel first featured in 1955 on the DS, which we can see opposite, and followed through all Citroën models until really the invention of the airbag, and airbags being standardised in Citroëns as they were with other cars. So, as I say, for 3 decades, a single-spoke steering wheel, as soon as you saw that wheel, you knew it was a Citroën, and that there were gradual evolutions of that. But say that this is classically simple, just a strand straight out, a rim, makes it a lot easier to see the instrumentation, and just nice and comfortable to use. Very, very Citroën, very Citroën. There's actually a bit of space in the back as well. It's a 2+2, but fine for kids, but fairly cramped otherwise. But as we come down the side, again, the wheel arch, classic Citroën in that it slices off the top of the wheel visually, but still comes to this very truncated rear end, classically Citroën, really from the days of the DS in 1955 and followed through to later models. And then quite an extreme curved hatch area with quite a large practical boot. As I mentioned, it was really the first work that Bertone did for Citroën, and that became a very fruitful relationship because Citroën went on to work closely with Bertone to design a number of models, from the BX of the early 80s, the XM of the late 80s, the Xantia, and so on. And in their design you could see again both Citroën but also a lot of Bertone influence there. The back's quite distinctive with this unusual light shape, a shape that's actually reflected on a number of modern cars now. For example, the latest Kia Ceed has this slight kick. But yeah, albeit now almost 50 years later. And as I say, inside, as I mentioned, this rather unique instrumentation is classically Citroën of the early 70s. The GS was the first Citroën and the first car in its class to have a drum speedometer. In the UK, sadly, that was never adapted for right-hand drive, so we had conventional instruments that worked fine, but weren't quite as modern, as high-tech as the drum instrument. And basically, for your speed, it wound round like basically a measuring tape, and it would show if you're doing 10 kilometers an hour, 20, 30. So you couldn't see the whole speedometer, as say just the drum, which is magnified here, so that it makes it very, very clear. That there's then a bit of a strip tachometer to show how many revs the car is travelling at. And also, just looking inside, a classic Citroën gear stick sort of coming out at you at a slightly odd angle, and also the height controls for the pneumatic suspension that the GS had, which is also shared with this car. So this car essentially is just on a regular GS platform, but obviously with a very, very different bodywork on it. As I mentioned earlier, being a huge Citroën fan and also a great admirer of Italian design, for me, this car has the best of both worlds. It's classically Citroën in profile. It has the very low aerodynamic snout, first seen in 1955 with the very innovative DS. It has the classic truncated tail, just sort of sawn off sharply, which helps with aerodynamics. And it also has that Italian flair and style that maybe some of the French cars lacked. As a kid, I actually had a little majorette model of one of these. From memory, it was bright metallic green, not the gold that this car is, this being the original colour. And as I say, it's sort of fun and playful. It's just very Citroën, but Citroën being a little more sporty, a little more adventurous than Citroën had traditionally been in this period. There was a bit of a plan, as I understand it, to actually produce a GS Coupe, this being Bertone's submission for that, but actually that didn't become a production reality, sadly. More the pity when you see this car, which even now, almost 50 years old, still looks exceptional today. You know, very sleek, very modern, very Citroën, and I say, very, very Bertone. But it's just a great thing to see, and I say, for me to be here standing next to this car today is just fantastic. It's made the trip to Paris for Retromobile worthwhile, never mind all the other fantastic cars that are here. So after the GS Camargue that we just looked at, we've moved forward 8 years, but you could argue we've moved forward a few centuries with this car. This is very space age. This is the Citroën Car-In from 1980, again a Geneva Motor Show car, and it's rather unusual. It resembles a sort of pyramid on wheels, really. It's a very sort of triangular shape. And already just stood here, there's a few things, Citroën, all about aerodynamics. This is perfectly aerodynamic, this car, which is why, for example, it doesn't have windscreen wipers. It actually has little jets of air here that, when it rains, shoot the air over the top of the windscreen and down over the back. Also great at speed, again, as I say, very aerodynamic, quite what it's like, stationary, stuck on the peripherique in Paris, I'm not too sure, but as I say, very, very aerodynamic. Also, in the aid of aerodynamics, you'll see it has no exterior mirrors. It actually has those, but they're placed here at the sides, and they unfurl at speed. So as you get from memory about 10 kilometers an hour, the mirrors pop out, and then you can see who's behind you, although you're probably way past them by then. The front as well, these very, very Citroën-esque, slightly inspired by the SM of 1970, these wide headlights. There should be the classic Citroën double chevron badge there. That seems to have disappeared over the years, not sure where it's gone. But say that is very, very Citroën, the real face of the brand, and really led with some of the later models, the BX, the XM of the late 80s, sort of reflected this style. This car, the car we looked at earlier, was designed by Bertone in Italy. This was actually designed by an Englishman, would you believe, but with a very Italian-sounding name. A chap called Trevor Frost, who changed his name to Trevor Fiore to make it sound more exotic, make it sound more exciting. A talented guy, a slightly unknown designer. He did a lot of work with TVR, for example, in the 1960s, designed the very handsome TVR Trident that we've had at Goodwood on the Cartier lawn a few times, and also at Revival. He headed up the design of Citroën for a while, once they started doing more of their own thing rather than using consultants such as Bertone, and felt it was almost a bit of a reinvention of Citroën. Came up with this radical sports car that, quite a few years ahead of the McLaren F1, is a three-seater but with a central steering wheel, so you don't need to worry about left-hand drive, right-hand drive markets. It also had a number of computers, dials, really more digital, and with lots of push buttons, which reflected what were known as the satellite pods that Citroën went on to use in the GSA and the Visa models. For the passengers, they also had a little computer down at the side here and a little toggle, so that they wouldn't be bored on the journey. They had things to play with. And the classic single-spoke steering wheel, there's a different take on here in that it's still effectively single-spoke, but there's a bit of a kink in it, so it almost looks like a bent paperclip. But as I say, this sort of triangulation continues through the very short roof, flush doors, and then again a very, very short truncated rear, but still lots of practical luggage space. Quite how you get in the back, I don't know, but and then this big bank of lights, which again the later XM used. And I say it's quite frivolous. It's a bit of a fun thing, never really planned as a serious production car, but really just to show a new face to Citroën moving forward into the 1980s, and actually the 80s proved to be commercially a fantastic era for them. A lot of great success with the BX, with the CX, the XM, the Visa. And as I say, this is a bit of fun. One unusual feature, very forward-thinking for 1980, it has a reverse camera. These are becoming quite the norm now, along with rear parking sensors, but in 1980 a reverse camera was unheard of, and in fact it doesn't have a rear view mirror. The camera is your mirror, and you can see that in the side pods as well. So with this, although it was a one-off concept, as I say, it led Citroën's design for some years to come. So again, the classic covered rear wheel that we first saw in the 50s with the DS for Citroëns, this more extreme one-piece panel effectively made it into production with later models like the BX that I've already mentioned. And having hydraulic suspension to change a wheel, for example, obviously you can't get to the wheel there, but you just simply put the car in its highest suspension setting, brings the bodywork up to sort of thigh level, pop the wheel off, new one on, back down, and away you go. So it's, although it doesn't look very functional, it doesn't matter too much with the raisable hydroelastic suspension.